where the secrets of the heart are written with ink and sealed with scandal. Welcome to channel, The Countess Chronicles.
What if I told you that the worst moment of your life, the moment when everything you believed in crashes down around you, could actually be the exact moment that saves you from wasting decades on the wrong path? Sounds crazy, right? We're taught that betrayal destroys us, that public humiliation ruins us, that walking away from what everyone expects makes us failures. But here's the truth nobody wants to admit. Sometimes the people who look like they're losing everything are actually the only ones, brave enough to win. Lady Catherine Ashford discovered a devastating secret just hours before her wedding to one of England's most powerful dukes. And what she did next didn't just shock London's high society. It changed the trajectory of her entire life and inspired countless women to question everything they'd been taught about loyalty, dignity, and what they're supposed to tolerate in the name of love. You've probably felt it before. That sinking sensation when you realize something you've invested your heart, time, and dreams into isn't what you thought it was. Maybe it was a relationship where you ignored the red flags because you'd already told everyone it was the one. Maybe it was a career path you committed to because it looked good on paper, even though it was slowly killing your spirit. Maybe it was a friendship where you kept giving and giving while getting nothing but manipulation in return. Maybe it was a family dynamic where you're expected to accept toxic behavior in the name of keeping the peace, which really just means keeping yourself small so nobody else has to change. That moment of revelation, when the truth becomes undeniable, is absolutely terrifying because you're standing at a crossroads. Do you pretend you didn't see what you saw and keep moving forward with a lie? Or do you acknowledge the truth and face the enormous consequences of acting on it? Most people, and be honest with yourself here, choose the comfortable lie over the difficult truth. We've all done it at some point. We stay in situations that don't serve us because leaving feels harder than enduring, because we've already invested so much, because we're terrified of what others will think. But Catherine did something that most people only fantasize about during their angriest, most frustrated moments. When she discovered that Duke Edward Thornhill had been conducting a secret affair throughout their entire engagement, she didn't just cancel the wedding quietly or confront him in private. She didn't take the dignified route that society expected, which really just means suffering in silence so everyone else stays comfortable. No, she walked into that chapel filled with 200 of England's elite, stood at the altar in front of everyone who mattered in Victorian society, and exposed every detail of his betrayal before refusing to marry him in the most public way imaginable. The mystery isn't why she did it. It's why more people don't do exactly the same thing when they discover they're being lied to, disrespected, or taken for granted. Why do we protect people who've betrayed us? Why do we prioritize everyone else's comfort over our own dignity? Why do we accept the codes of silence that keep us trapped in situations that are slowly destroying us from the inside out? Here's the controversial truth that's going to make some of you uncomfortable. Most of the mature, wise, practical advice you've been given about handling betrayal and difficult relationships is actually designed to keep you compliant, not to make you happy. When people tell you to think about what you're giving up, or don't make decisions when you're emotional, or everyone makes mistakes, they're not necessarily looking out for your best interests. They're often protecting a system that benefits from your tolerance of bad behavior. Catherine was told by her own mother that all men have indiscretions, and that what mattered was the title and security he could provide. She was pressured by friends, family, and society to accept betrayal as normal, to lower her standards, to be reasonable. And if she'd listened to that advice, she would have spent her life in a miserable marriage, producing heirs for a man who didn't respect her, slowly losing pieces of herself until she didn't recognize the woman in the mirror. The forbidden question we're afraid to ask is, how many people do you know who followed that wise advice and ended up genuinely happy, versus how many are just successfully pretending? This story isn't just about a woman in Victorian England who made a dramatic scene at her wedding, though it absolutely is one of the most talked about moments in London's social history. This is about the universal struggle between what we know is right for us and what everyone else is telling us to accept. It's about the conflict between our authentic selves and the roles society demands we play. It's about recognizing that sometimes the most loving thing you can do for yourself is something that looks selfish to people who benefit from your sacrifice. Over the next several minutes, I'm going to walk you through exactly what Catherine discovered, the impossible pressure she faced from every direction, the strategic decision she made that nobody saw coming, and most importantly, the universal lessons her experience teaches us about courage, timing, self-worth, and the difference between being strong and being submissive. By the end of this, you'll understand why her moment of supposed ruin was actually her salvation. And you might start questioning some of the compromises you've been making in your own life. Because here's what I've learned both from studying stories like Catherine's and from my own painful experiences with betrayal and difficult choices. The moments when we feel most broken are often the moments when we're actually breaking free. The disappearance of what we thought our lives would be creates space for what our lives could actually become, if we're brave enough to build something real instead of maintaining something fake. Catherine lost a duke, a title, financial security, and social status, but she gained herself. And years later, when she'd built a life of purpose, authenticity, and genuine love with someone who actually respected her, she looked back on that moment at the altar as the best decision she ever made. The mystery isn't how she found the courage to walk away. It's why we think staying in situations that diminish us is somehow the braver choice. So let me ask you directly, what are you tolerating right now that you know, deep in your gut, is slowly destroying you? What lie are you living to keep other people comfortable? What would you do if you had Catherine's courage for just 5 minutes? Keep those questions in mind as we dive into her story, because by the end, you might just find the answers you've been looking for. You know that feeling when everything you thought was solid suddenly turns to sand beneath your feet? That's exactly what happened to Lady Catherine Ashford on what should have been the most exciting week of her life. There she was, 3 days before her wedding to Duke Edward Thornhill, sorting through gifts and finalizing seating arrangements in her family's estate in Hampshire, when a mysterious envelope appeared on her vanity table. No name, no return address, just a plain white envelope sealed with black wax that somehow screamed danger. Her hands started trembling before she even opened it, like her body knew something her mind hadn't processed yet. Inside, there was a letter written in elegant handwriting, detailing every secret rendezvous Edward had been having with Miss Delilah Worthington, the daughter of a wealthy merchant who lived just 3 estates away. The mystery of who sent it didn't matter anymore. What mattered was the truth bleeding through every word. The letter wasn't just words on paper. It was evidence of betrayal that had been hidden in plain sight for nearly 8 months. It described specific dates, specific places, specific conversations that left no room for doubt. She read about late-night meetings at the old Thornhill Library wing every Tuesday when she thought Edward was attending parliamentary sessions in London. Whispered promises made in the rose garden she thought was their special place, and codes they used in their correspondence. He signed his letters to Delilah as "Your devoted serpent," while signing Catherine's as "Your faithful servant." Her heart was racing so fast she could hear it pounding in her ears, drowning out everything else. The room started spinning, and she had to sit down at her dressing table before her legs gave out completely. Every memory she'd been cherishing suddenly felt contaminated, like someone had poured arsenic into her favorite Earl Grey tea, and she'd been drinking it for months without knowing. Her mind went into complete chaos mode, racing through 1,000 scenarios at once. Should she confront Edward immediately at his townhouse in Belgravia? Should she pretend she never saw it and just cancel everything quietly, telling everyone she'd fallen ill? The silence in that room was deafening, broken only by the sound of her own breathing getting faster and the ticking of the grandfather clock her late father had given her. It's like when you're driving confidently, and suddenly the GPS recalculates the route. You can insist on the old path or accept that you need to change direction. She was 200 meters from the altar at St. George's Chapel, and life's GPS had just screamed, "Wrong route." The weight of having invested 2 years, countless dreams, and her entire future into this relationship with the distinguished Duke of Thornhill came crashing down. Everything she'd planned, every conversation about their future children, Henry, Charlotte, and Margaret, they'd even chosen the names, every detail of the life they were supposed to build together in his ancestral manor in Yorkshire, it all felt like a conspiracy against her happiness. What really messed with her head wasn't just the betrayal itself, but the realization that she'd been living in a carefully constructed lie orchestrated by Edward and possibly his entire family. She started replaying every moment, every smile, every "I love you, my dearest Catherine," through this new lens of deception. Had he been thinking about Delilah when he kissed her goodnight after the opera last month? Was he laughing at her naivety with his close friend Lord Benjamin Crawford over brandy and cigars at their gentlemen's club? The forbidden affair had been happening parallel to their engagement, announced in the Times and celebrated by all of London's high society, and she'd been completely oblivious. It's that gut-wrenching moment when you realize the person you trusted most was the one hiding the biggest secret. Think about a time when someone you completely trusted let you down. Maybe a business partner who was embezzling funds from your company, a friend who was spreading malicious rumors behind your back, or a family member who betrayed your deepest confidence for their own gain. That sick feeling in your stomach, that knot that makes you want to throw up. That's exactly what Catherine was drowning in. The first 5 minutes after reading that letter were pure psychological warfare playing out in her pink and gold bedroom. Denial hit first. Maybe it's a lie. Maybe Lady Pemberton is trying to sabotage us because she wanted Edward for her own daughter. Maybe it's just jealousy from someone who can't stand to see me happy. Then came anger, hot and consuming like a wildfire, making her want to ride to Edward's estate immediately and burn everything down in front of his entire household staff. Fear followed closely behind. Fear of being alone at 23 years old. Fear of starting over when all her friends were already married with children. Fear of what the Duchess of Somerset and Lady Blackwood would say at their weekly tea gatherings. Fear of admitting to her mother that she'd been a complete fool. She looked at her wedding dress hanging on the mahogany wardrobe door, this beautiful ivory silk creation with hand-embroidered lace from Brussels that had cost her family a fortune. This symbol of a future that had just disappeared into thin air like morning fog. The conflict raging inside her was unbearable. Part of her wanted to scream and shatter every porcelain figurine in the room, while another part just wanted to curl up under her grandmother's quilt and pretend none of this was happening. What nobody tells you about moments like these is how time becomes elastic, stretching and compressing in impossible ways. Those first minutes felt like hours, yet looking back, it was all a blur of tears and trembling hands. She sat there in her burgundy velvet chair with that letter written on expensive cream stationery in her shaking hands, mascara running down her face, trying to breathe normally while her entire world was collapsing around her like a house of cards. The hidden truth was now exposed, and there was no putting that genie back in the bottle, no matter how much she wished she could unread those words. I remember when I discovered something that shattered my reality. It was like watching a stage play of my life and suddenly realizing I'd been watching it from the wrong angle the whole time, missing crucial scenes happening in the wings. Everything made sense now for Catherine. All those little weird moments she'd brushed off. All those times her gut told her something was off. But she ignored it, because she wanted to believe in the fairy tale of becoming the Duchess of Thornhill. The puzzle was solved, but the solution was absolutely devastating. The terror of having invested so much, emotionally, mentally, financially, socially, into something that was built on quicksand and lies is absolutely paralyzing. She'd turned down a proposal from Lord William Hastings, a kind man who genuinely loved her, for Edward. She'd distanced herself from her childhood friend, Miss Eleanor Price, who'd questioned whether Edward was really the one after seeing him at a ball whispering with Delilah. She'd compromised on 100 little things, like moving away from her beloved London to his isolated Yorkshire estate, because she thought they were building something permanent together. And now? Now she was holding a revelation that proved it had all been for nothing, that she'd sacrificed pieces of herself for a man who viewed her as nothing more than a convenient arrangement. It's like spending years building a grand estate, brick by brick, only to discover it was built on a fault line, and an earthquake was coming that would reduce it all to rubble. You can't unsee structural damage once you know it's there. You can't unknow what you know. The question wasn't whether the relationship was broken. It was whether she had the courage to walk away from the wreckage and face society's judgment. But here's where things get interesting. And this is where Catherine's story diverges from what most women in her position would have done. Instead of immediately riding to confront Edward at Thornhill Manor, instead of canceling everything in a tearful panic and hiding away in shame, something shifted inside her as the initial shock wore off. The heartbreak started crystallizing into something else, something cold and calculating like the first frost of winter. She realized that everyone else's comfort, Edward's reputation, the Thornhill family name, society's expectations, had been prioritized over her dignity for far too long. The codes of polite Victorian society demanded she handle this discreetly, spare everyone the embarrassment, take the high road silently, and disappear into the countryside. But why should she protect the reputation of someone who'd been systematically destroying her trust while standing beside her at garden parties and planning their honeymoon to the Italian coast? A dangerous thought started forming in her mind, one that would soon turn her private humiliation into the most talked-about revelation in London's social circles for decades to come. Here's what made everything 10 times worse. Catherine wasn't the last person to find out about Edward and Delilah. She was practically the only one who didn't know. Over the next 24 hours, as she quietly started asking careful questions to her lady's maid Margaret and her cousin Vivienne, the truth came spilling out like water from a broken dam. The Dowager Duchess, Helena Thornhill, Edward's formidable mother, had suspected something for months, but thought it would blow over before the wedding, treating it like a minor inconvenience rather than a devastating betrayal. Two of her bridesmaids, Miss Arabella Finch and Lady Charlotte Beaumont, had heard rumors circulating at Lady Pemberton's summer ball, but didn't want to ruin her happiness with unconfirmed gossip that might turn out to be false. Even some of Edward's own friends, particularly Lord Benjamin Crawford and Sir Thomas Whitmore, knew about the affair and treated it like some kind of open secret within their gentlemen's club, making jokes about it over whiskey and cards. The conspiracy of silence around her was suffocating, like being buried alive while everyone stood around watching. Everyone had decided, independently yet unanimously, that protecting her from the truth was somehow kinder than respecting her enough to tell her. The trace of betrayal wasn't just Edward's. It was in every person who'd smiled at her during tea parties, while hiding what they knew. You know when everybody in the room notices you've got toilet paper stuck to your shoe, but nobody tells you? It's embarrassing, but it's way worse when you discover that everyone saw it and let you walk around looking foolish. Catherine was about to marry someone with that metaphorical toilet paper stuck to her entire life, and her whole social circle, from the Ashford family friends to the Thornhill relatives, had decided to stay silent. The humiliation of Edward's affair itself was painful, but this collective silence? This was a whole different level of betrayal that cut deeper than any single person's actions. She started remembering conversations differently now. That weird pause when her friend Lady Sophia Harrington mentioned honeymoon plans at the modist. Those sympathetic looks from Mrs. Elizabeth Blackwood that she'd mistaken for wedding excitement at the flower market. Those seemingly random comments from her. And Lady Beatrice about making sure you really know someone before marriage. They were all codes, all hints, all breadcrumbs she'd missed, because she was too busy being happy and planning her future as the Duchess of Thornhill. The hidden knowledge that everyone possessed except her made her feel like the universe's biggest fool, like a character in a tragic opera where everyone knows the ending except the protagonist. The pressure to just accept it and move forward hit her from every direction, like a coordinated attack orchestrated by society itself. Her own mother, Lady Margaret Ashford, bless her heart, actually sat her down in the drawing room and said, "Darling, all men have their indiscretions, especially men of Edward's station and wealth. What matters is that he chose to marry you, not her." Her future sister-in-law, Lady Victoria Thornhill, tried the cold feet, last wild fling excuse over afternoon tea, as if betrayal somehow became acceptable when it had a convenient label attached to it. Friends who'd been cheated on themselves, like Lady Penelope Morrison, whose husband had fathered 3 illegitimate children, tried to normalize it. "At least you found out he can't be faithful now, dear Catherine. Not after 10 years of marriage and 3 legitimate children to complicate matters." The most infuriating part? They weren't entirely wrong about the social consequences Catherine would face. In their world, the woman who cancels a wedding gets more judgment and vicious gossip than the man who cheats and breaks sacred trust. Society had set up this rigged game where she'd lose either way, stay and be disrespected by her husband, or leave and be gossiped about mercilessly by every woman in London. The conflict between what she knew was right in her heart and what everyone was pressuring her to do was tearing her apart like horses pulling in opposite directions. Think about this for a second. We live in a world that's harsher on the person who refuses to tolerate bad behavior than on the person displaying that bad behavior. It's like a twisted game where calling out the problem makes you the problem, where the victim becomes the villain simply for having standards. Catherine was being told, in 100 different subtle and not-so-subtle ways, by everyone from the Duchess of Somerset to her own younger sister Amelia, that her feelings were less important than everyone else's comfort and convenience. The wedding venue at St. George's Chapel was booked and decorated with thousands of white roses. Deposits totaling nearly £5,000 were non-refundable. 200 guests, including members of Parliament and minor royalty, had made travel arrangements from as far as Scotland. The engagement announcement had been in the Times, the Morning Post, and every society paper in England. Cancelling now would be Such a hassle for everyone. As if her dignity was worth less than other people's travel itineraries and social calendars. One aunt, the insufferable Lady Beatrice Ashford, even had the audacity to suggest over scones that every marriage has its challenges. My dear, and this was just Catherine's first test of her worthiness to be a duchess. Imagine being told that accepting infidelity before you're even married is a test of your commitment and character. The puzzle here wasn't why Edward cheated with Delilah Worthington. It was why everyone expected Catherine to be perfectly okay with it and smile gracefully. I'll tell you something personal. I once stayed in a situation way longer than I should have, because I was terrified of disappointing people who'd invested in my success. Not even the person who was treating me badly. I mean, everyone else around me. My parents who'd bragged about my accomplishments to their friends, colleagues who'd congratulated me on my achievements, friends who'd invested emotional energy celebrating my milestones. The weight of other people's expectations can become heavier than your own pain. And that's dangerous because you start living for them instead of yourself. There's this moment when you realize you're sacrificing yourself on the altar of other people's comfort, and you have to decide whether their opinion of you matters more than your opinion of yourself. Catherine was standing at that exact crossroads in her family's library, feeling the crushing pressure of hundreds of years of social conditioning telling her to smile, comply, and pretend everything was fine, like a proper lady. The silence she was supposed to maintain about Edward's betrayal felt like it was choking her from the inside out, stealing her voice and her power simultaneously. The difference between being strong and being submissive is something most people get backwards, especially in Victorian society where women were taught compliance from birth. Real strength isn't enduring abuse quietly. That's just survival mode. That's just making yourself smaller so others can be comfortable. Real strength is saying, "This isn't acceptable to me," even when everyone from your mother to the Queen's lady-in-waiting is telling you to tolerate it for the sake of propriety. Catherine started seeing the mystery behind why so many women in the Ashford family history had stayed in terrible marriages. Her grandmother, Lady Eleanor, who'd endured her husband's 3 mistresses, her great-aunt Constance, who'd lived separately from her philandering husband for 20 years. They'd been trained to believe that endurance equaled dignity, that suffering silently was noble and ladylike, that protecting the family name mattered more than protecting themselves from humiliation and heartbreak. Generation after generation of Ashford and Thornhill women had accepted affairs, disrespect, and neglect, because leaving would be scandalous and unbecoming. And what had that gotten them? Miserable lives dressed up as successful marriages, beautiful gowns covering broken spirits. She could literally trace the pattern back through her grandmother, great-grandmother, and beyond. A lineage of women who'd chosen appearance over authenticity, social standing over self-respect. The forbidden question started forming in her mind like a dangerous seed taking root. What if she broke that cycle entirely? But here's what really crystallized Catherine's decision into something unshakable. She overheard a conversation between Edward and his brother, Lord Richard Thornhill, 2 days before the wedding. They were in the study at Thornhill Manor smoking cigars, and she was walking past the slightly open door when she heard her own name spoken in Edward's distinctive baritone voice. Richard asked casually if Edward was going to end the affair with Delilah after the marriage, and you know what the Duke said? He laughed. Actually laughed. That condescending chuckle she'd always found charming, and said, "Why would I, brother? Catherine's not going to find out, and even if she does, she's too invested to leave now. She's already turned down Hastings, and no respectable man will want her if this engagement fails." The revelation that Edward wasn't even pretending to have remorse, that he saw her as too weak or too trapped to do anything about his betrayal, was the final piece of the puzzle. He'd calculated her response like a chess move and decided she was manageable, predictable, controllable. That's when something shifted inside Catherine from heartbreak to resolve, from victim to strategist. The codes of behavior that had been drilled into her since childhood at finishing school started feeling less like rules and more like chains designed to keep women compliant. And she started wondering, her mind working faster than it ever had. What would happen if she didn't just break those chains, but did it in a way that would make absolutely sure no one, not Edward, not society, not any man ever again, could underestimate her or treat her like a pawn in their game? Now, here's where Catherine's story takes a turn that nobody saw coming, not even her closest confidant Vivienne. What she didn't do after discovering Edward's betrayal with Delilah might surprise you more than what she actually did. She didn't cancel the wedding in a tearful panic, sending urgent telegrams to St. George's Chapel and leaving 200 guests confused and gossiping. She didn't make a scandalous public scene immediately, storming into the Thornhill estate and throwing Edward's belongings out the window while screaming accusations. She didn't even confront him in private at his townhouse in Belgravia, giving him the chance to manipulate her with tears and empty promises like she knew he would. Instead, Catherine did something that required nerves of absolute steel and a level of strategic thinking that would have impressed military generals. She kept the secret of her knowledge completely hidden, going through all the wedding preparations with a smile that never reached her eyes, attending the final dress fitting, confirming the flower arrangements of white roses and lilies, and acting like the blissfully ignorant bride everyone expected her to be. On the morning of the wedding, Catherine woke up in her family's estate and went through her routine as if it were any other day she'd been dreaming about since childhood. Her lady's maid Margaret helped her into that expensive ivory silk dress with Brussels lace, worth more than most families earned in 5 years. Her mother, Lady Margaret, fussed over her hair, weaving in pearls and orange blossoms while dabbing at happy tears. Her sister Amelia kept saying how beautiful she looked, how lucky she was to become a duchess. But inside Catherine's chest, beneath that perfectly laced corset, her heart was beating with a different kind of anticipation. Not nervousness about marriage, but the cold determination of someone about to execute a plan that would change everything. She'd spent 2 days carefully considering every angle, every consequence, every possible outcome. The codes of silence that society had tried to impose on her were about to be shattered in the most spectacular way possible. As she rode in the carriage toward St. George's Chapel with her father, Lord William Ashford, watching London pass by through the window, she felt something she hadn't felt in days. Power. The hidden truth was still concealed, but not for much longer. The ceremony began exactly as planned, with all the pomp and circumstance befitting a duke's wedding. The chapel was filled with England's elite, members of Parliament, wealthy merchants, minor royalty, the Duchess of Somerset sitting prominently in the third row. Edward stood at the altar in his finest morning coat, looking handsome and confident, probably congratulating himself on securing both a respectable wife and keeping his mistress. His best man, Lord Benjamin Crawford, stood beside him, the same man who'd known about the affair and said nothing. The Dowager Duchess Helena sat in the front row wearing emerald silk, her face a mask of aristocratic satisfaction at her son's advantageous match. Catherine walked down that aisle on her father's arm, the organ playing magnificently, every eye in the chapel on her, whispers of "How beautiful!" and "What a perfect couple!" following her like a wake. She could see Delilah Worthington sitting near the back, having had the audacity to attend, probably thinking she'd won some kind of twisted victory. The mystery of what was about to happen hung in the air like the scent of incense, but nobody suspected a thing. Everyone thought they were about to witness a fairy tale wedding, the beginning of a perfect aristocratic union. The vicar, Reverend Thomas Alcott, began the ceremony with traditional words that had been spoken at countless weddings before this one. Dearly beloved, we are gathered here today in the sight of God. Catherine barely heard him, her mind focused entirely on the moment that was coming. Edward took her hand, and she let him, feeling the ring he'd given her during their engagement. A family heirloom from the Thornhill collection. The readings were done, the hymns were sung, and finally they reached the vows. The vicar turned to Edward first. "Do you, Edward James Thornhill, Duke of Thornhill, take this woman to be your lawfully wedded wife?" Edward said, "I do," with that charming smile, probably already thinking about how quickly he could return to his affair now that the inconvenient wedding was complete. Then the vicar turned to Catherine, and the entire chapel fell into that hushed, reverent silence that precedes the bride's vow. "Do you, Catherine Elizabeth Ashford, take this man to be your lawfully wedded husband?" This was it. This was the moment she'd been planning for. Every eye was on her, waiting for the expected "I do" that would seal their fates together. Instead, Catherine did something that would be talked about in London's social circles for the next 50 years. She looked directly at Edward, her voice clear and steady, loud enough for every single person in that chapel to hear perfectly. "Before I answer that question, there's something everyone here needs to know." You could feel the shock ripple through the congregation like a physical wave. Edward's face went pale, then red, his confident smile disappearing. The Dowager Duchess Helena half rose from her seat. Catherine reached into the small bouquet of white roses she was carrying and pulled out a folded piece of paper. The letter that had revealed Edward's betrayal. The revelation was about to become very, very public. "This letter," she continued, her voice not shaking even once, "details an affair that my fiancé has been conducting with Miss Delilah Worthington for the past 8 months. While he was planning our future with me, he was making promises to her. While he was signing his letters to me as your faithful servant, he was signing hers as your devoted serpent." The conspiracy of silence was shattered in an instant, replaced by gasps, whispers, and the sound of Delilah Worthington trying to quietly escape through the side door. Catherine wasn't finished. She began reading specific excerpts from the letter. Not the intimate details, but enough to make the betrayal absolutely clear and undeniable. Dates when Edward claimed to be in parliamentary sessions, but was actually meeting Delilah at the old library wing. Codes they'd used in their correspondence. Promises he'd made to both women simultaneously. Edward tried to interrupt. "Catherine, please, this isn't the time." But she cut him off with a look that could have frozen hell itself. "No, Edward. You decided this wasn't the time for honesty 8 months ago. I'm simply correcting that mistake now." Lord Benjamin Crawford looked like he wanted to disappear into the floor. The Dowager Duchess Helena was fanning herself frantically. Lady Margaret Ashford was crying, but not tears of joy anymore. The evidence of Edward's betrayal was now exposed to every important person in their social sphere, and there was no way to hide it, no way to spin it, no way to make it disappear. The conflict that had been raging inside Catherine for days was now playing out externally for everyone to witness. It's like playing chess, really. You don't scream checkmate at the beginning of the game when your opponent can still escape. You let them feel confident, let them think they're winning, let them make moves that trap them further, until that final moment when there's nowhere left to go. Catherine had transformed her private humiliation into Edward's public exposure, using the very stage that was meant to celebrate their union to reveal his betrayal instead. She'd turned the tables so completely that the power dynamic shifted in front of 200 witnesses. After reading enough to make her point devastatingly clear, she looked at the vicar and said calmly, "To answer your question, Reverend Alcott, no, I do not take this man to be my husband. I will not bind myself to someone who has shown such forbidden disregard for honesty, faithfulness, and respect. This wedding is over." Then she turned, walked back down that aisle with her head held high, and left Edward standing at the altar in front of everyone who mattered in English society. The mystery wasn't why she refused. It was how she'd had the courage to do it so spectacularly. The chapel erupted into chaos the moment Catherine disappeared through those doors. Some guests were stunned into silence. Others were whispering frantically. A few were actually applauding her courage, though they'd never admit it publicly. Edward tried to follow her, but Lord William Ashford blocked his path with a look that promised violence if he took another step toward his daughter. The Dowager Duchess Helena was demanding explanations. Lord Richard Thornhill was trying to do damage control, and Delilah Worthington had already fled entirely, probably on her way to the countryside to escape the scandal. What Catherine had done was powerful for reasons that went beyond just the dramatic revelation. She hadn't run away from her truth or hidden it to protect everyone's comfort. She'd owned it completely and forced everyone else to face it too. She'd used the very platform that was meant to be Edward's moment of triumph and turned it into his moment of greatest shame. She'd transformed herself from victim to protagonist in her own story. And everyone there would remember it. The hidden had become undeniably visible, and there was no going back for anyone involved. The aftermath of what happened at St. George's Chapel spread through London faster than a wildfire through dry grass. Within hours, every drawing room, gentlemen's club, and tea parlor in the city was buzzing with the story of how Lady Catherine Ashford had publicly exposed Duke Edward Thornhill at their own wedding ceremony. The reaction from the 200 guests who'd witnessed it firsthand was a fascinating mix of shock, admiration, and the kind of scandalized gossip that high society lives for. Lady Sophia Harrington, who'd always been quietly sympathetic to Catherine, immediately visited the Ashford estate to offer her support, bringing with her a small group of women who were tired of society's double standards. Even Lady Penelope Morrison, whose own husband's infidelities were an open secret, showed up with tears in her eyes, saying, "I wish I'd had your courage 20 years ago." The support Catherine received from unexpected corners was almost as surprising as her bold action itself. Women who'd been strangers became allies overnight, bonded by the shared experience of watching someone finally refuse to accept what they'd all been told to tolerate. The revelation had created an unexpected sisterhood among those who'd witnessed it. But of course, not everyone was applauding. The old guard of Victorian society, particularly the Dowager Duchess Helena and her circle of friends including Lady Beatrice Ashford and the insufferable Duchess of Somerset, were absolutely horrified by what they called Catherine's unladylike behavior and theatrical disgrace. They gathered at Helena's townhouse the very next day, drinking tea and drafting a social strategy to minimize the damage to the Thornhill name while completely ignoring Edward's actual betrayal. To them, Catherine's public exposure was a worse sin than Edward's 8-month affair because she'd violated the most sacred rule: never air private matters publicly, never embarrass a man of station, never prioritize your dignity over social harmony. Lady Beatrice even suggested that Catherine should have handled it privately after the wedding, as if marrying a known cheater first was somehow the appropriate course of action. The conspiracy among these women to paint Catherine as the villain rather than the victim was both predictable and infuriating. They were more concerned about the disruption to their comfortable social order then about the actual betrayal that had caused it. The codes of silence they'd built their entire lives around were being threatened, and they didn't like it one bit. Edward himself tried multiple times to reach Catherine in the days following the cancelled wedding, but Lord William Ashford had given strict orders that he was not to be admitted to their estate under any circumstances. Edward sent letters, 17 of them in the first week alone, each one more desperate than the last, trying different strategies to win her back. First came apologies. "My dearest Catherine, I've made a terrible mistake." Then came explanations. "It meant nothing. She pursued me. I was weak." Then came promises. "I'll end everything with Delilah immediately. I'll spend the rest of my life making this up to you." And finally, when nothing else worked, came barely veiled threats about her reputation and future prospects in society. Catherine read exactly none of them. She had her lady's maid, Margaret, burn each one in the fireplace without opening them, watching the wax seals melt and the paper turn to ash. The mystery of whether he was genuinely remorseful or just afraid of the social consequences didn't interest her anymore. His words, whether written or spoken, had lost all value the moment she'd discovered his betrayal. The silence she maintained in response to his desperate attempts at communication was more powerful than anything she could have said. When Edward finally realized Catherine wasn't going to respond to letters, he made the catastrophic mistake of trying to justify himself publicly at his gentleman's club. After several glasses of brandy with Lord Benjamin Crawford and Sir Thomas Whitmore, he complained loudly about how Catherine had overreacted and humiliated him unnecessarily over what he called a minor indiscretion that all men are entitled to. He actually said those words, "entitled to," as if betraying someone's trust was a privilege that came with his title. Unfortunately for Edward, one of the men present that night was Lord William Hastings, the same man Catherine had rejected to marry Edward. And William had no loyalty to protect Edward's reputation. He made sure that Edward's exact words got back to Catherine, and also spread strategically throughout their social circle. The forbidden truth of Edward's complete lack of remorse became impossible to hide. Men who might have defended him as just being a man suddenly found themselves unable to justify his arrogance. Even Lord Richard Thornhill, Edward's own brother, was overheard at a dinner party saying, "My brother's affair was bad enough, but his response to being caught shows he hasn't learned a damn thing." The evidence of Edward's character flaws was becoming clearer to everyone, and his attempts to paint himself as the victim were backfiring spectacularly. You know what's interesting about consequences? When you rip off a Band-Aid quickly, it hurts intensely for about 2 seconds, and then it's done. The pain is over, and healing can begin. But when you pull it off slowly, trying to minimize the discomfort, you end up in pain for 20 minutes with no real benefit from the caution. Catherine had chosen the quick, intense pain of public exposure over the slow torture of a private dissolution. Yes, there were immediate consequences that hurt like hell. The wedding deposits, nearly £5,000 total, were completely lost, money that the Ashford family couldn't easily afford to waste. The scandal was enormous, making Catherine the subject of every conversation in London for weeks. Some of her mother's friends stopped visiting, uncomfortable with the controversy. A few distant relatives sent disapproving letters about proper behavior and family reputation. But here's what Catherine gained in exchange for that immediate pain: freedom. The kind of deep, existential freedom that comes from knowing you chose your own dignity over everyone else's comfort. She'd lost the wedding, lost the title of Duchess, lost the financial security that came with marrying into the Thornhill fortune. But she'd gained something infinitely more valuable. What changed for Catherine in those first chaotic days wasn't just her marital status. It was how she saw herself and how certain people began to see her. The women who supported her started treating her differently, not with pity, but with a kind of reverent respect usually reserved for war heroes. Young ladies who were being pressured into unwanted engagements started seeking her counsel, asking how she'd found the courage to walk away. Her younger sister Amelia, who'd always been the more conventional one, looked at her with new eyes and said, "I never knew you were this strong, Catherine. I thought I was supposed to be the brave one." Even her father, Lord William, a traditional man who'd initially been mortified by the public scandal, pulled her aside one evening in his study and said something she'd never forget. "I raised you to be a lady, but you've become something better. You've become a woman who knows her worth. I'm proud of you." That moment, right there, made every uncomfortable consequence worth it. The conflict between societal expectations and personal integrity had been resolved, and she'd chosen the latter. She'd gained respect from the people whose opinions actually mattered, while losing the approval of people whose values she no longer wanted to emulate. Think about the people in your life who treat you differently based on how much you respect yourself. It's like a mirror. When you stand up straight and refuse to accept less than you deserve, suddenly the people around you have to adjust their perception. Some will respect you more. Some will be uncomfortable because your boundaries highlight their lack of boundaries. And some will disappear entirely because they only valued you when you were easy to control. Catherine experienced all three reactions simultaneously. Lady Sophia and her circle became closer friends than ever before, bonding over honest conversations about the realities of marriage and society's hypocrisies. Lady Beatrice and the Dowager Duchess Helena stopped inviting her to events, which Catherine considered a blessing rather than a loss. And Edward? He faded into irrelevance in her life, becoming nothing more than a cautionary tale she'd occasionally reference. The mystery of who she'd become in the aftermath was fascinating. She wasn't bitter, she wasn't broken, she was just awake. Awake to realities she'd been sleepwalking through before. The most unexpected consequence came about 3 weeks after the cancelled wedding. The Times published an anonymous letter, though everyone suspected it was written by a woman, possibly even multiple women, praising Catherine's courage and calling for reform in how society handles infidelity and women's autonomy in marriage decisions. The letter sparked a broader conversation that went far beyond Catherine's individual situation, touching on issues of women's rights, marital expectations, and the double standards that plagued Victorian society. Catherine never confirmed whether she'd written or inspired the letter, maintaining a dignified silence on the matter. But its impact was undeniable. Suddenly, her personal stand against betrayal had become symbolic of something larger, a small crack in the foundation of an unjust system. She'd lost a duke, but gained a voice that resonated far beyond London's ballrooms. And as she sat in her family's estate, reading that letter while drinking her morning tea, Catherine realized something profound. The disappearance of her planned future had created space for something she'd never imagined possible. A future she'd build entirely on her own terms, without compromising who she was for anyone's comfort. The first days after everything collapsed were strange in ways Catherine hadn't anticipated. The Ashford estate, which had been buzzing with wedding preparations and constant visitors just weeks before, suddenly felt eerily quiet. But it wasn't the uncomfortable silence of isolation. It was the peaceful silence of finally being able to breathe without performing for anyone. She'd wake up in her bedroom without that immediate knot of anxiety in her stomach, without having to mentally prepare for another day of pretending everything was perfect with Edward. Her lady's maid Margaret noticed it first, commenting one morning while helping Catherine dress, "Miss Catherine, you look different. Your face isn't as tight anymore." if that makes sense. And it did make sense, perfectly. Catherine was experiencing the profound difference between being alone and being free, and they weren't the same thing at all. Being alone can feel empty and scary, like you've lost something essential. Being free feels like you've finally found something you didn't know you were missing: yourself. The mystery of her own identity, which had been buried under expectations and roles and the performance of being Edward's perfect fiancée, was finally emerging. For the first 2 weeks, Catherine mostly stayed within the estate grounds, not hiding exactly, but giving herself permission to exist without an audience. She spent hours in her late father's library. Lord William had moved the collection there after his own father's death, reading books she'd never had time for when her days were consumed with wedding planning and social obligations. She rediscovered her love for poetry, particularly the works of Elizabeth Barrett Browning, finding unexpected resonance in poems about strength and autonomy. She started keeping a journal, something the Dowager Duchess Helena had always said was unbecoming for a lady of station, writing down her thoughts without censoring them for anyone's comfort. The codes of behavior she'd been following her entire life started to feel less like rules and more like suggestions she could choose to accept or reject. One afternoon, she was reading in the garden when her cousin Vivian visited and found her laughing at something in a book. "I haven't heard you laugh like that in months," Vivian said with tears in her eyes. "I didn't realize how much you dimmed yourself until now, seeing you bright again." That observation hit Catherine hard, making her realize how much of herself she'd been suppressing to fit into the shape Edward wanted. After a fire tears through a forest, the landscape looks absolutely devastated. Charred trees, ash everywhere, seeming destruction as far as you can see. But here's what most people don't know. Fire is actually essential for certain ecosystems to regenerate. Some seeds only germinate after being exposed to intense heat. The ash enriches the soil. Within months, new growth appears that's often healthier and more diverse than what existed before. Catherine was living through her own version of this natural cycle. The revelation at St. George's Chapel had burned down the life she'd been building. And yes, it looked like complete destruction from the outside. Her mother, Lady Margaret, was still occasionally crying about the lost opportunity of becoming a duchess's mother. Society gossips were still whispering about the scandal whenever she was mentioned, but Catherine herself was experiencing something unexpected. She was discovering parts of herself that had been dormant for years, seeds that were finally getting the conditions they needed to grow. The trace of who she'd been before Edward, curious, opinionated, passionate about things beyond social status, was returning. About a month after the cancelled wedding, Catherine made her first major decision about her future, and it shocked everyone, including herself. She announced to her parents that she wanted to do something previously unthinkable for a woman of her station. She wanted to learn. Not the superficial accomplishments taught at finishing school, watercolors and French and piano, but real education. She wanted to study literature seriously, maybe even history and philosophy. Lord William was initially resistant, worried about how this would look socially, but Lady Margaret surprised everyone by supporting Catherine's decision. "Let her learn," her mother said firmly. "If she can survive what she's been through, she can handle university-level books." Catherine began corresponding with Miss Eleanor Price, her old friend who'd tried to warn her about Edward, who connected her with a progressive tutor named Professor James Whitley, who'd been teaching women, privately, for years. Within weeks, Catherine was spending her mornings in rigorous study, her afternoons reading and writing, her evenings discussing ideas with people who valued her mind rather than her potential as a decorative wife. The conflict between what society expected of her and what she wanted for herself was resolving in favor of authenticity. She also made the difficult but necessary decision to cut ties with people who'd enabled Edward's betrayal through their silence. Lady Charlotte Beaumont, one of her former bridesmaids who'd known about the affair, tried to visit and was politely but firmly turned away. "I can't have people in my life who value their comfort over my dignity," Catherine told Vivienne. Charlotte knew, and she said nothing. That's a choice that speaks to her character, and I deserve better. This wasn't about punishment or revenge. It was about recognizing that some relationships are built on foundations that can't support real friendship. She surrounded herself instead with people like Lady Sophia Harrington, who'd immediately offered support, and even began building new friendships with women outside her usual social circle. Miss Eleanor introduced her to a group of progressive women, writers, artists, early suffragettes, who gathered monthly to discuss literature and politics and women's rights. For the first time in her life, Catherine was part of conversations where her thoughts mattered more than her family name. The hidden world of intellectual women that existed beneath society's surface was a revelation, showing her possibilities she'd never imagined. I remember my own period of reconstruction after a major life collapse. It felt like being shipwrecked and having to build a raft from whatever materials washed ashore. You don't get to choose what you have to work with. You just have to be creative and determined. Some days I felt strong and capable. Other days I felt completely lost and overwhelmed by the enormity of starting over. Catherine experienced both extremes often within the same day. There were mornings when she woke up energized by her studies and her growing sense of independence, feeling like she was finally becoming who she was meant to be. And there were nights when she'd cry into her pillow, not necessarily missing Edward, but grieving the future she'd imagined, the children she'd named, the life that would never exist now. The disappearance of that imagined future was a kind of death, and she had to mourn it, even while being grateful she'd escaped. What I learned, and what Catherine was learning, is that reconstruction isn't linear. It's messy and complicated, and full of contradictions. You can feel grateful and sad, strong and vulnerable, hopeful and terrified, all at the same time. The key is not judging yourself for the complexity. About 3 months into her new life, Catherine did something that demonstrated just how much she'd changed. She attended a society event for the first time since the canceled wedding. Lady Sophia was hosting a charity gala for orphanages, and she'd personally invited Catherine, promising she'd be supported and protected. Catherine wore a deep blue gown, not the pastel society expected of unmarried women, but a rich, confident color that reflected her internal transformation. When she walked into that ballroom, conversations literally stopped. People stared, whispered, waited to see what she'd do. And Catherine? She held her head high, smiled at the women who'd supported her, ignored the ones who'd gossiped about her, and completely avoided acknowledging Edward, who was there with his mother, trying to rehabilitate his image. The mystery of how she'd not only survived but seemed to be thriving was the subject of every whispered conversation that night. By the end of the evening, several young women had approached her privately, asking how she'd found the courage to walk away, sharing their own struggles with unwanted engagements and family pressure. Catherine realized something profound that night. Her pain had become purposeful. Her story was giving other women permission to imagine different endings for their own stories. The secret to her strength wasn't that she didn't feel fear or doubt. It was that she'd decided those feelings didn't get to make her decisions anymore. She was building a new life, brick by brick, and nobody else held the blueprint but her. 6 months after the scandal at St. George's Chapel, something unexpected started happening that nobody could have predicted, not even Catherine herself. Her story, which had initially been dismissed by the old guard as a cautionary tale of what happens when women get too bold, was quietly becoming something else entirely. It was becoming inspiration. Young women across London and eventually across England started writing to her. Letters arrived at the Ashford estate almost daily. Some signed, many anonymous, from women trapped in similar situations who'd heard about what Catherine had done. "Your courage gave me the strength to refuse a man my father chose," wrote Miss Sarah Pemberton from Yorkshire. "I watched you at St. George's, and I finally understood that my happiness matters," wrote another from a woman who only signed as a friend. Catherine kept every single letter in a wooden box her late grandfather had made, reading them on difficult days when doubt crept in. The revelation that her personal pain had sparked something larger than herself was both humbling and empowering. She hadn't set out to become a symbol, but the trace of her decision was rippling outward in ways she was only beginning to understand. Lady Sophia Harrington, who'd become one of Catherine's closest allies, suggested something radical during one of their afternoon teas in early spring. "Catherine, have you considered speaking publicly about your experience? Not in a scandalous way, but in a way that could actually help other women?" Catherine's first instinct was to refuse. Speaking publicly went against every rule of Victorian propriety she'd been raised with. But the more she thought about it, the more it made sense. She'd already broken society's biggest rules by exposing Edward at the altar. What was one more transgression in service of something meaningful? After weeks of careful planning with Sophia and Miss Eleanor Price, Catherine agreed to speak at a private gathering of women interested in reform and women's rights. The event was held at Lady Sophia's townhouse, invitation only, with about 40 women in attendance ranging from young unmarried ladies to established matrons who'd survived their own marital disappointments. When Catherine stood up to speak, her hands were shaking just like they had when she'd first read that letter about Edward's betrayal, but her voice was steady and clear. The mystery of how to transform personal trauma into collective wisdom was something she was navigating in real time. Catherine's speech wasn't a dramatic retelling of her cancelled wedding. It was something deeper and more subversive. She talked about the codes of silence that protect men's bad behavior while punishing women's honest reactions. She discussed how society trains women from birth to prioritize everyone's comfort over their own dignity, to smile through disrespect, to make themselves smaller so men can feel bigger. "We're taught that our value comes from who chooses us," she said, looking around the room at faces that reflected recognition and pain, rather than from who we choose to be. She shared the letters she'd received from women across England, reading excerpts that highlighted how widespread these issues were. She talked about the conspiracy of well-meaning family members and friends who encourage women to accept less than they deserve, because that's just how things are. And then she said something that would be quoted in drawing rooms for months afterward. "The most radical thing a woman can do in our society isn't to make a scene. It's to believe she deserves better and act accordingly. That's what they're really afraid of. Not our anger, but our standards." The room erupted in applause that lasted several minutes, and Catherine saw tears on faces throughout the audience. The silence around women's experiences was being broken, one honest conversation at a time. Word of Catherine's speech spread through London's progressive circles like wildfire, and suddenly she was being invited to speak at other gatherings, salons, and private events. The old guard of society, the Dowager Duchess Helena, Lady Beatrice, the Duchess of Somerset, were horrified, calling her unladylike and a dangerous influence on impressionable young women. But their disapproval only seemed to amplify Catherine's credibility among the women who were tired of the old ways. Within a year of the cancelled wedding, Catherine had become an unlikely voice for women who wanted more autonomy in their lives, particularly regarding marriage decisions. She didn't call herself a suffragette or an activist. Those labels would come later. But she was undeniably part of a growing movement. Professor James Whitley, her tutor, connected her with a publisher who was interested in women's perspectives on marriage and society. Catherine began writing essays, first published anonymously, and then, as her confidence grew, under her own name. Her first published piece, titled "The Forbidden Question: What Do Women Owe Society?" appeared in a progressive journal and was immediately controversial, discussed in both supportive and critical terms across London. The mystery of how a cancelled wedding had launched a writing career was really no mystery at all. Catherine had found her voice and refused to quiet it. Edward Thornhill had probably thought, in those first days after Catherine walked away, that she'd eventually come crawling back, or at least fade into obscure spinsterhood, while he moved on relatively unscathed. Instead, while he was struggling to rebuild his reputation and eventually entering a loveless arranged marriage with a woman chosen by his mother to rehabilitate the Thornhill name, Catherine was building something genuine and meaningful. She wasn't just surviving, she was thriving in ways that had nothing to do with him. The conflict that had once consumed her had transformed into purpose, and purpose is a powerful motivator. She'd turned her pain into a platform that was actually helping other women navigate similar situations. That's not revenge in the petty sense. That's the best kind of victory, the kind that creates positive change. The plot twist of Catherine's life wasn't just that she recovered from the betrayal. It was that she became more influential and respected than she ever would have been as the Duchess of Thornhill living a lie. As Edward's wife, she would have been expected to host parties, produce heirs, and smile decoratively while having no real voice or impact beyond her household. As Catherine Ashford, independent woman and emerging writer, she was contributing to actual conversations about women's rights and social reform. She'd traded a title for authenticity, financial security for intellectual freedom, social status for self-respect, and somehow ended up wealthier in all the ways that truly mattered. By the second year after the scandal, Catherine had published a collection of essays that sold surprisingly well, particularly among women. The royalties weren't enormous, but they were hers, money she'd earned through her own work, rather than inherited or received through marriage. Lord William, who'd initially been mortified by her unconventional path, admitted one evening, "I thought you'd ruined yourself, Catherine. Instead, you've made yourself into something remarkable. I was wrong to doubt you." That acknowledgement from her father meant more than any society approval ever could. And then there was the matter of genuine love, which Catherine had almost given up on entirely after Edward's betrayal. About 18 months after the cancelled wedding, she met Captain James Montgomery at one of Lady Sophia's intellectual gatherings. James was recently returned from military service abroad, refreshingly direct in his communication and completely uninterested in society's games. He'd heard about Catherine's story and, instead of being scandalized, told her he admired her courage. "Most people would have taken the easy path and regretted it for life," he said during their first conversation. "You chose the hard path and created a life worth living. That takes real strength." Their friendship developed slowly and naturally, built on mutual respect and honest conversation, rather than social advantage or family pressure. James encouraged Catherine's writing, attended her speaking events, and treated her like an intellectual equal rather than a decorative prize. When he eventually proposed, he did it privately in the Ashford Library, saying, "I'm not asking you to complete me or to fulfill some social obligation. I'm asking if you'd like to build something together while we both keep being exactly who we are." Catherine said yes, not because she needed to be married, but because she'd found someone who genuinely valued who she'd become. The secret to finding real love, she realized, was becoming someone you respected first. Everything else followed naturally from there. The transformation was complete in ways both visible and invisible. Catherine had lost the Duke of Thornhill but gained herself. She'd lost social standing with the old guard, but gained genuine respect from people whose opinions actually aligned with her values. She'd lost the fantasy of a perfect aristocratic marriage, but gained the reality of purposeful work and authentic relationships. The transformation was complete in ways both visible and invisible. Catherine had lost the Duke of Thornhill, but gained herself. She'd lost social standing with the old guard, but gained genuine respect from people whose opinions actually aligned with her values. She'd lost the fantasy of a perfect aristocratic marriage, but gained the reality of purposeful work and authentic relationships. The disappearance of her planned future had created space for an actual future that she'd built with her own hands, her own mind, her own choices. When Catherine and James married in a small, intimate ceremony with only close friends and family present, it was everything her wedding to Edward wasn't: honest, joyful, and built on a foundation of mutual respect rather than social calculation. As she stood at the altar with a man who truly knew her and loved her anyway, Catherine thought back to that moment at St. George's Chapel when she'd walked away from Edward. Best decision she'd ever made. The hidden truth she'd discovered along the way was simpler than she'd expected. Your worst betrayal really can become your greatest redirection, but only if you're brave enough to walk away from what's wrong and stay committed to finding what's right. Now, Catherine's story isn't just about one woman in Victorian England who walked away from a duke at the altar. It's about something much bigger that applies to your life right now, today, regardless of whether you're dealing with betrayal, difficult decisions, or moments when everyone's telling you to accept less than you deserve. The first universal lesson Catherine's experience teaches us is this: your value doesn't depend on other people's approval or recognition. Think about it. There were 200 people at St. George's Chapel that day, including members of Parliament, wealthy merchants, and minor royalty, all expecting Catherine to say, "I do," and complete the fairy tale. Society had invested in her becoming the Duchess of Thornhill. Her own mother wanted it. The Thornhill family expected it. But Catherine's worth wasn't determined by fulfilling their expectations. It was determined by her own integrity and self-respect. When she refused to marry Edward despite all that pressure, she was making a radical statement. My dignity matters more than your comfort. That's not selfishness, that's self-preservation. The secret here is understanding that people who truly value you will respect your boundaries, and people who only value what you can do for them will always be disappointed when you choose yourself. The second lesson is about timing, and this one's crucial because so many people get this wrong. Catherine didn't react impulsively the moment she discovered Edward's affair with Delilah Worthington. She could have confronted him immediately, could have canceled everything in a panic, could have made decisions based on the initial shock and pain. Instead, she took time to think strategically about what would actually serve her best interests. She waited. She planned. She chose the exact moment that would give her the most power and make her point undeniably clear. It's like chess. You don't make random moves just because you're upset. You think several steps ahead and position yourself for the outcome you want. In your own life, when something devastating happens or when you discover a truth that changes everything, give yourself permission to pause before reacting. The best decisions rarely come from panic. They come from that space where emotion meets strategy, where you feel everything fully but act thoughtfully. The codes of immediate reaction that society often expects aren't always in your best interest. Sometimes the most powerful thing you can do is wait for exactly the right moment to make your move. The third universal truth Catherine's story reveals is that courage isn't the absence of fear. It's doing the right thing while you're absolutely terrified. Catherine's hands were shaking when she opened that letter revealing Edward's betrayal. Her heart was racing when she walked down the aisle at St. George's Chapel, knowing what she was about to do. She was scared of being alone, scared of society's judgment, scared of financial insecurity, scared of disappointing her family. The fear was completely real and valid. But she did it anyway, because she understood something profound. Temporary fear is better than permanent regret. Think about the bravest thing you've ever done. I guarantee you were scared while doing it. That's what makes it brave. If there's no fear involved, it's just a regular decision. Catherine teaches us that waiting until you feel completely confident before taking necessary action means you'll never take action at all. You act despite the fear, not after it disappears. The mystery of courage is that it looks confident from the outside, but feels like terror on the inside. And that's perfectly okay. Every person who's ever done anything worth doing felt that same combination of conviction and fear. Here's the fourth lesson, and it might be the most important one. Your worst betrayal can genuinely become your greatest redirection, but only if you're willing to see it that way. Catherine thought her life was over when she discovered Edward's affair 3 days before their wedding. She thought she was losing everything: her future husband, her social status, her financial security, her carefully planned life. And in one sense, she was losing all those things. The revelation of his betrayal, as painful as it was, saved her from a lifetime of unhappiness. In your own life, when something falls apart that you thought was essential, a relationship, a job, a plan you'd invested years in, try asking yourself, what if this isn't a tragedy, but a course correction? What if I'm being redirected towards something better that I couldn't see while I was committed to the wrong path? The fifth lesson addresses something we all struggle with: the difference between what looks good and what actually is good. Catherine was about to become a duchess, which looked absolutely perfect from the outside. Prestigious title, ancestral manor, financial security, social status that would benefit her entire family. But the reality underneath that shiny surface was rotten. A husband who didn't respect her, a relationship built on deception, a future of pretending. Everything was fine while slowly dying inside. Society trains us to chase things that look impressive, rather than things that feel authentic. And that's how people end up living lives they hate while appearing successful. Catherine chose authenticity over appearance, and while it cost her socially in the short term, it gave her a life she actually wanted to live. When you're making important decisions, ask yourself, am I choosing this because it looks good to other people, or because it actually aligns with who I am and what I value? The hidden truth is that most people are too busy worrying about their own lives to judge yours as harshly as you think they will. And the ones who do judge aren't living lives worth emulating anyway. Choose what's real over what looks good every single time. The sixth universal principle is about the power of rewriting your own narrative instead of letting others define your story. After Catherine walked away from Edward at the altar, society tried to paint her as either a victim to be pitied or a troublemaker to be condemned. The old guard wanted to make her into a cautionary tale about what happens when women don't know their place. But Catherine refused both narratives. She didn't hide in shame, and she didn't seek revenge. Instead, she took control of her own story by speaking honestly about her experience, by writing essays that reframed her decision as strength rather than scandal, by becoming a voice for other women facing similar situations. She transformed from a character in other people's gossip into the author of her own life story. In your life, people will always try to define you based on your worst moments, your biggest failures, your most controversial decisions. They'll create stories about who you are and what your choices mean. And those stories often say more about them than about you. Don't accept their version. Tell your own story. Own your decisions. Explain your reasoning if you want to, or don't if you prefer. Either way, make sure the narrative you're living is one you're actively creating rather than passively accepting. The mystery of identity isn't about discovering who you've always been. It's about deciding who you're going to become and having the courage to live that truth, regardless of outside opinions. Think about a butterfly trapped inside a cocoon. From the outside, it looks like a prison, like something confining and limiting. The butterfly could stay there forever, comfortable and protected from the outside world, never taking the risk of transformation. But to become what it's meant to be, the butterfly has to destroy that cocoon. It has to struggle through the painful process of breaking free, which is actually what strengthens its wings for flight. Without that struggle, without that destruction of the old form, the butterfly would never fly at all. Catherine destroyed the cocoon of her expected life, the perfect wedding, the Duchess title, the conventional path everyone anticipated for her. She went through the pain of transformation that included public scandal, family disappointment, and complete uncertainty about her future. But on the other side of that painful emergence, she flew. She soared in ways that would have been impossible if she'd stayed trapped in the comfortable cocoon of a lie. The conflict between safety and growth is something every person faces at crucial moments. Catherine teaches us that sometimes you have to break what looks secure to build what's actually real. The secret to transformation isn't avoiding pain. It's choosing the right kind of pain, the kind that leads to growth, rather than the kind that comes from slow suffocation in a life that doesn't fit who you really are. So here we are at the end of Catherine's story, but really, this is just the beginning of yours. You've just spent the last several minutes learning about a woman who had every reason to play it safe, to accept less than she deserved, to prioritize everyone else's comfort over her own dignity. And she refused. She stood at that altar in front of 200 people and chose herself. She walked away from a duke, from financial security, from social status, from everything society told her she should want, because she understood something profound. A life built on lies, no matter how beautiful it looks from the outside, will eventually suffocate you from the inside. Now, the real question isn't what Catherine did. You know that story now. The real question is, what are you going to do with this knowledge? Because information without application is just entertainment. And I didn't share this story to entertain you. I shared it to challenge you, to wake something up inside you that's been sleeping while you've been tolerating situations that don't serve you. Let me ask you something directly, and I want you to be brutally honest with yourself. What's your version of Edward Thornhill? What betrayal, disrespect, or soul-crushing compromise are you currently accepting because walking away feels too hard, too scary, too uncertain? Maybe it's a relationship where you keep finding evidence of lies, but convince yourself you're overthinking it, because leaving would mean admitting you wasted years. Maybe it's a job that's slowly destroying your mental health, but you stay because the money's good or because you've invested so much time that starting over feels impossible. Maybe it's a friendship where you're always the one giving, supporting, showing up, while they take and never reciprocate. Maybe it's a family dynamic where you're expected to accept toxic behavior in the name of keeping the peace, which really just means keeping yourself small so nobody else has to change. whatever it is, and you know exactly what it is, because it's the thing that came to mind when I started this paragraph. That's your secret that everyone's pretending not to see. That's your conspiracy of silence where people around you know you're unhappy, but nobody's telling you to leave because your staying makes their lives easier. Here's what I need you to understand. Catherine's courage didn't come from being fearless. It came from deciding that temporary pain was better than permanent regret. She was absolutely terrified when she opened that letter revealing Edward's affair with Delilah. Her hands were shaking, her heart was racing. She wanted to hide or pretend she never saw it. But she made a choice in that moment that changed everything. She decided her dignity mattered more than everyone else's expectations. And you have that same choice available to you right now, today. Not tomorrow, not when you feel more ready, not when the circumstances are better. Right now. What would happen if you stopped waiting for permission to respect yourself? What would happen if you stopped protecting people who aren't protecting you? What would happen if you chose the hard path that leads to authenticity over the easy path that leads to slow death of your spirit? The codes that keep you trapped: don't be selfish. Think about others. Be reasonable. You've invested so much already. Those aren't wisdom, they're chains. And you're the only one with the key. Let me tell you what's going to happen if you don't apply what you've learned here. You're going to finish this video, feel inspired for about 20 minutes, maybe share it with a friend, and then go right back to the situation that's making you miserable. You'll convince yourself that your circumstances are different, that you can't do what Catherine did because your situation is more complicated. You'll list all the reasons why staying is the smart choice. The mortgage, the kids, the career, the family expectations, the fact that sometimes things are good, so maybe it'll get better. And 5 years from now, you'll be in the exact same place or worse, wondering why you didn't act when you had the chance. Wondering why you wasted more years on something you knew wasn't right. The mystery of why people stay in situations that destroy them isn't really a mystery at all. It's fear dressed up as practicality. It's cowardice disguised as patience. It's self-abandonment masquerading as loyalty. Don't let that be your story. But here's what could happen instead if you actually take this seriously. You could make today the day everything changes. Not by making some huge dramatic gesture necessarily, though sometimes that's exactly what's needed, but by making the internal decision that you're done accepting less than you deserve. By drawing a line and meaning it. By saying, "This ends now," and backing it up with action. Catherine didn't just survive walking away from Edward, she thrived. She built a life of purpose, found genuine love with someone who respected her, became a voice for other women facing impossible choices, and looked back years later knowing she'd made exactly the right decision at exactly the right moment. That same transformation is available to you, but you have to be willing to go through the uncomfortable middle part, where everything's uncertain and scary, and people are questioning your choices. You have to be willing to look like you're losing while you're actually winning. You have to trust that the disappearance of what no longer serves you creates space for what actually will. So I'm going to challenge you right now with some questions, and I want you to actually answer them. Not out loud necessarily, but honestly in your own mind. What would you do if you knew, with absolute certainty, that staying in your current situation would lead to regret 5 years from now? What would you do if you had Catherine's courage for just 5 minutes? What would you do if you stopped caring what people who aren't living your life think about your choices? What would you do if you believed, really believed, that you deserve better? If your answers to those questions are different from what you're currently doing, then you already know what needs to change. The revelation isn't what you should do. You already know that. The revelation is whether you're going to actually do it or keep making excuses. Are you going to be someone who reads inspiring stories and then goes back to tolerating disrespect? Or are you going to be someone who takes inspiration and transforms it into action? The conflict between who you are right now and who you could become is resolved by the choices you make in the next 24 hours, not by the intentions you have or the plans you make for someday. Here's my final challenge to you, and this is where the rubber meets the road. I want you to do one thing in the next 48 hours that demonstrates you're serious about respecting yourself. Not something huge necessarily. It could be having an honest conversation you've been avoiding, setting a boundary you've been too scared to set, making a phone call you've been putting off, or even just saying no to something you'd normally agree to out of obligation. One action that proves to yourself that this wasn't just another video you watched while scrolling, but a turning point where you decided your dignity matters more than other people's comfort. Because here's the hidden truth about courage. It's not something you have or don't have. It's something you build through small acts of choosing yourself over and over until it becomes natural. Catherine's moment at the altar was dramatic, yes, but it was built on thousands of smaller moments where she decided her truth mattered. Start building yours today. What's the one thing you know you need to do, but have been too scared to do? Do that. Today. Not tomorrow. Today. If Catherine's story resonated with you, if something in this video made you think differently about your own situation, if you found yourself nodding along or feeling that uncomfortable recognition of your own compromises, then I need you to do something important. Subscribe to this channel and hit that notification bell. Why? Because stories like this, stories that challenge conventional wisdom, that give you permission to choose yourself, that show you examples of courage in action. These aren't the stories you'll find everywhere. Most content is designed to keep you comfortable, to tell you what you want to hear, to reinforce the safe choices. This channel exists to do the opposite, to wake you up, to challenge you, to show you what's possible when people choose authenticity over approval. There are more stories like Catherine's coming, more lessons about courage and transformation and choosing yourself even when it's terrifying. Don't miss them. Subscribe now, turn on notifications, and commit to continuing this journey of learning how to respect yourself enough to demand better. Your future self, the one who finally walked away from what was destroying them, who built something real and authentic, who looks back with pride instead of regret. That future self is thanking you right now for taking this seriously. Now go do the thing you know you need to do. Your Catherine moment is waiting.